take note of who we are and where we are. As visitors to the University of British Columbia, I was about to say West Indies. So I paused. As visitors to the University of British Columbia, we would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is a traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and so we do not take it lightly. I must also tell you that this is not an ordinary conference. When people of like minds gather, great stuff happens. So turn around and smile and say, it's great to see you here.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
It's great to see you here.
Yeah, you better now.
Yeah, Shelley.
All right, so let's move right along. At this time, I would like to invite our host, Professor Annette Henry, to come. But before I do so, she says, Denisha, this is too formal, and this is not my thing, but it would be release of me not to introduce her properly, right? So Professor Annette Henry, she holds the David Lamb Chair in Multicultural Education in the Faculty of Education at this University of British Columbia. She's a professor in the Department of Language and Literacy Education and cross-appointed to the Institute for Race, Gender, Sexuality, and Social Justice. Her scholarship examines race, class, language, gender, and culture in sociocultural contexts of teaching and learning in the lives of Black students, Black oral histories, and Black women teachers practice in Canada, the US, and the Caribbean. She has written extensively about equity in the academy, diverse feminisms, and conceptual and methodological research issues, especially in culture-specific contexts. She is the 2018 recipient of the Canadian Association of University Teachers Equity Award. Everyone, please make her welcome today's host. Yes.
I love all my students, but I have to say that when you get students like Denisha in your classes, it's such a joy, and it just seems like the class rolls along, and it's wonderful when students really support you and have you back, so to speak, and so I appreciate her so much, and she's been outstanding helping me organize this conference, and she's the type of person that sees things that need to be done, that you don't have to ask her to do them. And as you can tell, she has such a wonderful sense of humor, so she's really a joy to work with. So I'd like to say good morning to everybody, and thank you for coming out on this rainy Saturday, and we're so busy in our lives, and Saturdays are days where we catch up, so it's difficult. I know people have said they'd be in and out during the day. I want to thank also Yuya Takeda, a PhD student in my department, and Yuya has been so good helping me record and curate the sessions we've had, the conferences, the talks we've had, and he's just been so faithful, so thank you very much, Yuya. First speaker, and it's my great pleasure knowing about and reading his work. Dr. Barrington Walker is our first speaker. He's a renowned scholar, historian, and he's senior advisor for equity, diversity, and inclusion at Wilfrid Laurier University, also a professor. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Toronto. Prior to coming to Wilfrid Laurier, prior to going to Laurier, he taught at York University and Queen's University. His academic research and publications focus on Black Canadian history, legal history, race and immigration, and human rights. He's the author of Race on Trial, Black Defendants in Ontario's Criminal Courts, 1858 to 1958, and he's the editor of The History of Immigration and Racism in Canada, Essential Readings, and the African Canadian Legal Odyssey, Historical Essays. He's currently working on several books at various stages of completion. I'll just talk about a couple. Colonizing Nation is a study of race, immigration, and colonization in Canada. Dark Poets is a meditation on blackness and race and violence in Canada's urban landscape, mostly in Toronto, but relevant throughout the country. Other projects include a study of blackness, coloniality, and citizenship in Canada, biopolitics and deportation in Canada and between Canada and the Caribbean, and a biography of Black Canadian legal scholar and political pioneer, the Honourable Leonard Braithwaite. He's the editor of the Journal of Canadian Historical Association and a member of the Executive Council of the Canadian Historical Association. The title of Barrington's talk is Resisting the Political, Black History, Black Scholars, and the Canadian Academy. So let us welcome Dr. Barrington.
Thank you, Annette, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for organizing this wonderful day and the opportunity to come back to British Columbia, lovely British Columbia, and to meet with the community of scholars of Black Canada and those of you who aren't scholars of Black Canada, who are allies and who are interested in this work and platforming this work and highlighting this important work. The title of this talk is directly inspired by the work of my late friend, Dr. David Seeley. David passed away a little over 10 years ago, in December of 2009. David was a polymath, truly the smartest person that I have ever met, and I say this without a hint of hyperbole. He was trained in the law, having spent a brief time at law school. I believe that David was a student at the University of Ottawa Law School. He pursued a doctoral degree in criminology and yet another in philosophy. When I met David in the late 1990s, he was pursuing a doctoral degree in criminology at the University of Toronto in the university's Center for Criminology. I was a doctoral student in history at the same university and a junior fellow at the same center. In 2000, Ronaldo Walcott published an edited collection titled Rude, Contemporary Black Canadian Cultural Criticism. The collection, in essence, created a space where the authors fleshed out, quote, encounters between blackness and nation, where neither was viewed as, quote, sacred, innocent, nor free from critical engagement and debate. Indeed, in some cases, harsh critique. The collection also sought to show the ways in which founding narratives of Canada, quote, leave little room for imagining blackness as constitutive of Canadianness. David's contribution to the collection was called Canadianizing Blackness, Resisting the Political. David's essay was divided into two parts. The first was a meditation on blackness and modernity, where he grounded his interpretation, following the work of Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy, in the idea that the very fact of blackness is integral to what it means to be modern. The very notion of blackness, he said, is caught up in the series of events, movements, appropriations, translations, involved in the development of capitalism and the nation state, all of which partially make up the modern. David posits, or he posited, this notion of modernity and the integral nature of blackness to this project in what he called contradistinction to the grand narrative of modernity, the grand narrative that comes out of Europe that we're all saddled with, and the rationality of the universal white subject that denies political equality to blacks, who are the embodiment of the quote-unquote ultimate other. Much of black freedom struggle, David suggests, and I'm going to switch in and out between present and past tense because I feel like he's still with me sometimes, so I know he's gone, but you'll have to indulge me that. In the case of anti-colonial and anti-slavery movements, quote, modern notions of subjectivity, equality, democracy, and rationality were appropriated as tools for the use of subordinated groups. While black people and other subordinated groups resisted the political order that denied them access to the modern, defined by political equality and democracy, in the post-World War II era, the era of late capitalism, David said, the assimilationist stances of these earlier movements were replaced by the language of self-determination and actualization. For example, in the Black Power movement. This move, said David, drawing on the work of Richard Rorty, signals a shift from what he called classic modern liberalism to postmodern bourgeois liberalism. That was a move from public policy that ignored difference and particularity in the name of universal personhood to one that acknowledges difference and diversity in the name of pluralism. So very much the world that we inhabit right now in terms of social movements and how social movements are often articulated. In the second part of his essay, David extends his discussion into the realm of Black Canadian identity. So here he pushes against the dominant notion, or he pushed rather against the dominant construction of Canadian identity that reduces Blackness in Canada to an essentialist and an essential quasi-religious and Africanist discourse in favor of one that recognizes the heterogeneity of Black life in terms of gender, sexuality, and class, a sensibility that is more commonly referred to as intersectionality today. David was writing at a time just before that language became common parlance in the academy. Second, David rejected the dominant notion of Blackness in Canada that posits that it is, quote, impossible to be Black and Canadian at the same time, since Canada is imagined as either a place without Black people or where the few Blacks there are well-behaved. The connection looms large here between Blackness construed as political in a post-civil rights sense and insurgent political activity that is framed as criminal activity. So David said often when Black people do get inspired to act in ways that are politically active, that there's no space in the dominant imagination to see this kind of behavior as anything but, and through the lens of criminality. And that's a very specific Canadian problem, a white Canadian problem. So, David's work has me thinking deeply about what exactly it might mean for the writing of Black Canadian history as a historian of Black Canada. Is it possible to write the history of Black people in Canada as a purely intellectual project, or is the writing of Black Canadian history inevitably a political project? It might have related to my own experiences of building, I want to relate this to my own experiences of building the scholarly career that I now have. In the first version of this talk, I was going to walk you through the major contours of Canadian historical writing over time. And I decided not to do too much of this today after thinking it over. And you can ask me more about this in the Q&A if you're interested. Or you can read about it, if you're interested, in a forthcoming chapter I have with Dr. I'm so sorry. I'm tired. And Michelle Johnson. I decided rather, I almost just said Funke. I decided rather to tell you a bit about my intellectual journey instead, if you'll indulge me. And I want to be frank here, but at the same time, I am wary of divulging a little bit too much. But here goes. I did my undergraduate degree at York University, and I started it in the late 1980s, and I finished it up in 1992. I always had a keen interest in Black history. My problem, however, was twofold. First, I received virtually no formal education on the subject. Before I went to York, I was educated at Pickering High School in Ontario. And Pickering has been in the news lately because the power plant, the nuclear power plant. My problem, however, was, the curriculum there was a standard fare for the time and for the place. It was heavy on STEM courses, with a hodgepodge of courses in the social sciences, I suppose they were called, history, English, world issues. These were the days when the curriculum was heavy on what can only be called a certain kind of Canadiana at my school. A Canadiana laced with an almost unbearable whiteness. A Canadiana where there was no place for us, the eternal visitors, the newcomers, the interlopers. Those of us who were drawn to the humanities had to run the gauntlet of books written by Margaret Atwood, most notably Survival, a book that still makes me shudder to this day, Margaret Conrad, etc. I even had one English teacher who spent an entire year indulging her love of the legend of King Arthur and the Bronte sisters. I was weak in STEM, so these are sorts of courses that I was forced to endure during my high school years. There was no talk of indigeneity or multiculturalism in those days in my school, even though I was going to a school in a Toronto suburb that had absorbed a large influx of Black folks who were from another suburb the one that Funke grew up in, that was more proximate to Toronto. Harvey area, yeah. The white teachers in my school could see that the school in which they were teaching during the 4 years I was there as a student was rapidly multiculturalizing, rapidly blackening. But they stuck to teaching us about narrative archetypes in Canadian fiction a la Atwood. I really hated that book. With dogged determination. Never mind that a near race riot broke out in my high school in response to these dramatic demographic shifts brought on by the golden age of suburban development, greedy and corrupt city councillors who are in the back pocket of said developers who paid farmers to pack up and leave town so their farms could be paved over, and with some of the best agricultural land in the Golden Horseshoe in Ontario, I might add. And striving black folks who wanted a piece of the Canadian dream, who were drawn to Ajax and Pickering. So it's not just that my teachers ignored our histories and cultures, and by our, I mean black students, the few that there were, but they were actively opposed to any attempt to bring it into their school. And I tried. Admittedly, I was a bit of a pest at times. I sought to provoke at every opportunity. But I quickly realized that if I wanted to learn anything about the histories of black people, I would have to do it on my own. It didn't go over well. With only 1 or 2 exceptions, my teachers deeply resented my constant attempts to try and bring these issues into the school. My good friends, who were, shall we say, of the go-along and get-along variety, gladly fueled the perception that I was a half-baked black militant because it took the heat off of them. I was bad and a misbehaved nigger, so they could be good Negroes. I survived that place, and I looked forward to my university career. I couldn't leave that high school behind quickly enough. So this brings me to York University. I didn't know much about York before I started. I knew that I might want to be a lawyer, and I had researched Osgoode Hall in high school. I obsessed over it really, because I fancied myself a judge one day. And York changed my life, really, and I have not been shy about saying it repeatedly over the last 30 years, almost 30 years. I had been starving intellectually before I arrived there, but I didn't know the depths of my hunger until after a rocky first year. And after that, I threw myself into my intellectual work at York. It was a place where my intellectual curiosity and my tendency towards intellectual provocation was rewarded more often than not. A place where the penalty for being an intellectual was not nearly as severe as in my high school, where good students were treasured, but critical thinkers were punished. So I went about immersing myself in my history courses, and I was to discover that, like now, it was one of the finest history departments in North America. I received a first-rate training there, training that served me well until graduate school. But even in the midst of one of the most multicultural universities in Canada, a friend of mine who teaches at Bucknell University, Anthony Stewart, referred in his work to York's image as the most progressive university in Canada, in contradistinction to the University of Toronto, perhaps the most conservative. Even in the midst of York, though, things were far from perfect. I came to slowly realize a few things about York over time. Its faculty didn't match its student body, or even approximate it. And this is a problem, I think, that still exists today, though admittedly, I don't pay much attention anymore because I have concerns to deal with on my own campus. During my entire time at York, I didn't have a single black professor, and I only had 2 professors who were non-white. Imani Banerjee, in a large sociology lecture during my first year, and a sessional instructor who taught Chinese history. That was it. But that did not prevent the university from congratulating itself for being so progressive and diverse. Second, I realized that I had to work to find blackness in the curriculum at York. I took a course on the Black Urban Experience in my second year that changed my life. I met my undergraduate mentor who encouraged me to go to graduate school. In other courses, say on U.S. antebellum and postbellum history, or the post-war history of the U.S., or my political science courses, I chose to write my research on the Black experience when and where I could. But it slowly dawned on me that I was largely educating myself again about a lot of these issues, as I had in high school. I also realized years later that even the little sliver of blackness meant very particular things at York University. It meant that the history of the Caribbean, which did not interest me, perhaps that made a difference in how I came to perceive the institution. and it meant Africa as well as the Caribbean. One of my most poignant memories of a course was of a course I took in African history taught by one of the top scholars in the world. And what struck me was the cruelty, the faintly veiled glee with which he informed his overwhelmingly black class, and this professor was and is white, that they should disabuse themselves of any misguided idea that they were descended from kings and queens in Africa. This was on the first day, just to squash that before he carried on to the real business of talking about African history. The blackness that was in York's backyard, and by that I mean Jane and Finch, never did seem to make it onto the syllabus. As Ronaldo Walcott once pointed out to me many, many years ago, York is in one of the most heavily concentrated black neighborhoods in Canada, which you would not have known it from the curriculum. Blackness in Canada were being discussed in this place, but little to no discussion was concerned with locating one in the other. If you wanted to study blackness, I was told not in so many words, you didn't take Canadian history courses. And that's why as an undergraduate, I never did. So thus, when I arrived at the University of Toronto to pursue a master's degree, it was in the history of the US South, in a pattern that was to hold for most of my time at U of T. I found that the department on a whole was tolerant. It was generally tolerant of my work and of my presence there, and I was fortunate to find pockets of support when I could. I was interested in the history of Reconstruction in particular, for those of you who know anything about US history, and I had an opportunity to further enhance my understanding of the antebellum and postbellum periods in US history. I was fortunate enough to work with one of the leading scholars of US Southern history in Canada. I also managed to produce a decent publication on the 1866 Memphis riots that was based on my MA work. All in all, I had generally positive experiences during that time. It was far from perfect, but I grew immensely intellectually during that period, rather. Toward the end of my MA year, I was attending a talk in U of T's history department, and I don't remember what the talk was about, in all honesty. After the talk, I struck up a conversation with a middle-aged white woman. I did not know who she was or her connection to the department, and she didn't tell me. She was genuinely interested in the fact that I was there, occupying that space in a place where there was virtually no black presence. And there were only a handful of other black students, including Afua Cooper, who's here today, who was a year or two my senior in the program, and already well established in the field of black Canadian history. In the course of my conversation with this person, more of a friendly interview really, is what it turned out to be, the person asked what I was studying, and I replied, Black American history, Black US history. She said that, if I recall correctly, she asked me about some of the details of my work, which I was happy to share. After thinking about my responses for a brief period, she then asked me, are you a Black American? And to this I responded, no, I'm a Canadian. So why then, she asked, are you writing about Black Americans? I stared at her blankly. Are there things you could be researching about the history of black people in Canada, she asked. I don't remember my response because my mind was reeling at the time. So there was a part of me that was annoyed by this line of questioning. I thought, who does she think she is? And I had a ready academic arsenal of fancy objections to her line of inquisition. She, at the very least, was oversimplifying the intellectual enterprise, was she not? Perhaps she didn't understand how things were done in the academy. And most damning of all, she was, at the very least, she was being essentialist and probably presentist as well. And the latter is a word that graduate students in history love to toss around as the ultimate diss. Didn't she know that one's current location should not drive academic interest alone? Did she not realize that one does not have to belong to a specific group to write its histories or otherwise do intellectual work about a group? But as I sat with it during my many GO train trips into my suburban apartment and back into the city, I realized that this meeting had deeply unsettled me. And it unsettled me because this person cut right to the heart of something I didn't have a grammar to articulate. In a well-known 1996 article, an engagement with and critique of Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, in an engagement with Paul Gilroy's work, George Eliot Clark asked, must all blackness be American? In many ways, my life story and my family story embodied elements of Black Canadian history. Stories of migration, settlement, racial capitalism, displacements, diasporas, survival, and the unrelenting encounter with white supremacy as its intersectional registers and the Canadian racial state. And yet I knew virtually nothing, very little, about how my own experiences and my family history was situated within a broader historical landscape in Canada. Others were already heading down, or had headed down this road. I mentioned Afua Cooper, Dr. Cooper, and certainly scholars like Robin Winks and James Walker. But I, at this stage of my intellectual journey, had yet to encounter these works. In short, my academic knowledge did not match with my experiential knowledge. My experiences as a Black person moving through Canada were not anchored by or informed by knowledge of Canadian history, knowledge of Black Canadian history. I'd been trying to understand my life through a lens that was not mine. And I'm sure that Pan-Africanists or historians of the diaspora or transnational historians of Blackness will strongly disagree, but I stand by my claims. That conversation, again, left me deeply unsettled, and I decided then, after thinking about it, to switch my field. Once I overcame the epistemological and ontological barriers that had told me again and again that Blackness and Canadianness were mutually exclusive, despite my lived experiences, it opened everything up for me. I could begin to engage in the sort of intellectual practice that I will talk about briefly in the third section of the paper. I could start to anchor myself in a history that would help me understand the nuances and complexities of Black lives and white supremacy in the place that I was living in. But while intellectually vistas were opening up at this period of my life, some things were closing down. And again, I can talk about this more in the Q&A if you wish. Suffice it to say that it would soon become clear that while my intellectual vistas were starting to widen, as I read more and more, my career prospects were starting to dim rather dramatically. Where were the job ads in my new field? Where were the positions? Where were the departments? Where were the journals? Where were the professional associations? Who, in short, would pay me and hire me to ever teach this stuff? Who would hire me to write about Black folks here? But I could put that aside in the short term. I was only beginning to explore doctoral programs, and there was plenty of time to worry about that in the years ahead. But I was running into the same problem of which I was only dimly aware of at York. Where was Black Canada in the Canadian Academy? So one of my most vivid memories of that time, just before the end of my MA, and at the beginning of my plunge into doctoral studies, was a meeting I had with a rather famous Canadian historian, who was then the chair of a major university that will remain nameless. I could not believe my good fortune at securing this meeting, and I went into it with very high hopes. Indeed, I was looking forward to applying to the doctoral program at his school. When the meeting started, I expressed my interest in the study of Blacks in Canada, and I was not sure what exactly I would study, and frankly, at this point, I didn't know enough to say definitively what my original research contribution might be. The great man listened intently, and then he pronounced his verdict with great, or so he must have thought, sensitivity. There was not a field of Black Canadian history, he said. It didn't exist. There was not only was there no literature to speak of, and this was odd in light of the fact that at the time of my meeting, many scholars such as Robin Winks, James Walker, and Jason Silverman had published books on the subject. And I had no idea of this at the time, but he should have known, given the fact that he was in charge of the person who was in charge of his graduate program. He informed me that there was little lived history of Black people here, and what was here was of little to no consequence. Seeing how crushed I was at this news, he designed to give me a ray of hope before he wrapped up the meeting. Perhaps, he said, you could think about researching other groups as well as Black people. Perhaps think about other immigrant groups and newcomers, because there will not be enough there for you to do a dissertation. I'm paraphrasing there somewhat because it was many years ago. I left the meeting dejected, but strangely undeterred. So here is the Cliff Notes version of the rest of my intellectual biography. So I won't walk you through the next 18 years of an academic career at my first university. because as of this telling, I have not even started my doctorate yet. So I decided to stay at the University of Toronto to pursue my doctorate in Canadian history. I worked with one of the foremost scholars on the history of immigration and migration in Canada, xwməthkwəy, and I eventually figured out what I wanted to do for my PhD research. And after thinking about doing a social or labor history of black borders, I settled on a study of blacks in Ontario's criminal justice system that would eventually be published as Race on Trial. And I formulated much of the work that went into that dissertation and the book when I was a junior fellow at the Center of Criminology at the University of Toronto. It was also during that time that David and I became good friends and intellectual comrades. He from the lofty perch of continental and analytical philosophy as well as critical theory, and me from the trenches of the manuscript archives. That time made me aware that I had to take matters into my own hands. I had to be dexterous in thinking about my career. So I tried to position myself in ways to maximize my chances at an academic career. I tried to have a foot in the law and society world. I also tried to position myself within the discipline of history in ways that would do the same. I decided that it would be a good idea to frame myself as a scholar of race and immigration rather than just black Canadian history, because I figured it would maximize my chances with departments who were reticent to hire someone to just teach our marginal subfield in Canadian history. And I was fortunate enough to land an academic appointment at Queen's in the Department of History in the early 2000s. I was a beneficiary of work, planning, and timing, and of course, luck. The first two I have just described, the latter two was a consequence of me being the last generation to benefit from mandatory retirement just before the job market crash of 2008. I settled into life in my department, teaching, researching, writing, and supervising graduate students across the fields of Black Canada, race, and immigration. And over the nearly 18 years I spent at Queen's, I had hoped that I would see more positions open up in the field of Canada, more positions for black scholars in Canadian history. But there were a few. Dalhousie, of course, and the Johnston Chair that Afua was the last holder of before the current one. McGill come to mind immediately. But in truth, if it wasn't for US departments like Princeton University, the University of Minnesota, the University of Vermont, and the University of Maine, there would have been even fewer positions than what we have seen. After 20-some odd years, my graduate institution has decided to advertise for a junior position in Black Canadian history. One can only hope that other major departments will soon follow suit. I have since moved on to a new post at Wilfrid Laurier University, a senior academic post and a senior administrative position addressing EDI. And my hope is that my academic work and my lived experiences will help me with my second attempt at this sort of work. I did it years ago at Queen's and I'm doing it again now. And time will tell. At the very least, this position will help me to open up spaces for critical scholar allies and scholars of color who do critical work, and perhaps the most vulnerable constituency in the university. My move into senior administration is an attempt to move from merely lamenting the state of affairs to sitting at the table. So in conclusion, this talk has given me an opportunity to think about my reflections on the state of Black Canadian historical scholarship in light of both David's foundational work about Black Canada and the place of the Black historian in Black Canada. When David spoke of resisting the political, my understanding is that he was talking about the political articulations of Blackness in the post-World War II period and the ways in which these identities have been historically and are rejected by mainstream Canada in favor of passive forms of assimilation. The demands for Black particularity, which are not only framed as political, but even criminal, as I said before, and think, for example, of the iconic example of the Sir George Williams affair in 1960s Montreal. It strikes me that the writing of Black Canada is its own kind of insistence of both Blackness being constituted of Canadianness, quite a different position than merely saying that we are here, in my view, and also a declaration of an insistence for the importance of Black life here and for Black particularity. The same political stance that is staunchly resisted by the Canadian polity as a whole. It's no surprise that it's resisted in the Academy. There's a long history of Black Canadian history and Black Canadian scholars in particular being rejected by mainstream historiography and Canadian history departments. Black history and Black study more broadly has enjoyed unprecedented visibility nonetheless in the Canadian Academy. But I want to make it clear that the situation was quite dismal beforehand. We now see that, again, there are junior professorships starting to emerge at flagship research universities. The James Johnson Chair in Halifax is on its 4th holder, Dr. Dryden, and Black Canadian historians are active in the CHA. The Wilson Institute named 3 scholars of Black Canadian history as part of its fellows program, which I was very happy to see. And there's the emergence of the Black Canadian Studies Association. All of this again suggests that some movement, some improvement has taken hold in the field. The question of the success of Black scholars of Black Canada is somewhat more complicated. While there are external forces that limit the opportunities and visibility of Black scholars of Black Canada, it is alarming that in a community of scholars that is as small as it is, there are undeniably internal dynamics that do the same. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Barrington, and if anybody has any questions or comments? Water. Yes, we'll get some water.
Thanks, Barrington. You mentioned that, I think, during your doctorate, you started to diversify your academic research to better position yourself for job prospects. But have you found in your professional career that you still, just by having an opinion on the state of Black Canadian history, etc., does it tokenize you in your faculty at all, or does that exist, or is that getting better?
I think maybe right now I'm named to an academic position, but I'm not actively teaching. I'm more fully ensconced in administrative work. I should speak into this so everybody can hear. So I'm more fully ensconced in administrative work right now rather than just teaching. Say just teaching, that didn't come out right. Again, I'm jet lagged, you know. I didn't mean it like that. Teaching is a noble calling and I love it and I miss it and so on and so forth. But I think by virtue of the fact that there's so few of us in our respective departments that there's, I don't want to say it's an inevitability, but it's very difficult to avoid being tokenized. And sometimes I think we worry about that too much, right? Somebody has to go first. Somebody has to be the first person to enter into a space. And, you know, trailblazers also take the most abuse. Right? It's the ones that can sort of slide in behind them. This is the next benefit, the next generation that usually benefits from, I'm just teasing, but it's the next generation that typically benefits from people who blazed trails. So I think, yeah, I mean, there is almost a certain kind of inevitability about that when you're one of the only people. But, you know, that I think that there's a capacity for that situation to change rather quickly with just the addition of maybe 1 or 2 faculty members, but it's hard, right? There are some places that think that we just need to hire one and sort of satisfy the clamor from people who are insisting on change, and then we will sort of heap all of this pressure on this one person. But then we also need to be honest. I won't use the crude sort of saying, maybe after, and I won't say it on camera if somebody asks me, but we have a saying in the Black community about, you know, there's some kind of Black folks who, they're only happy when they're the only Black person in the room or the only Black person at the table, and it's like there's a certain syndrome, and I won't name exactly what that's called here, but we have to get past that too, right? And I think we've all encountered situations where there was somebody who was the token this or that in the department, and they were often remarkably resistant to your appearance on the scene when you try to enter that space, sometimes more so than white folks, right? And that's something that we have to actually be honest about as well. There are some of us who find there's a certain power in tokenization, right? You don't really have to be good if you're the only one, right? You just have to be. Thank you.
In your current position right now, in more of an administrative role, do you have the opportunity or the privilege to hire more or diversify employment to see more people of color, more Black people specifically?
I mean, it's early days for me. It's 2 weeks
Oh,
into
okay.
the job.
Okay.
Lots of big talk, but really I'm barely warmed my seat.
Okay.
And I'm still in the process of actually moving and all these other sorts of things. But I mean, that is one of the objectives of the work, right? That is one of the things. It's an advisor position, and we can talk about the limitations of that kind of title as well, and why universities love to hire advisors and this sort of thing. But that's one of the challenges of the job. But it's the challenge, right? So for me, a lot of the talk around, climate and addressing, systemic change in universities, a lot of it comes down to resources, right? So it took me a long time to figure out, when I was a youngin' in these universities, people are so, like, why? You can have perfectly civil conversations with colleagues until it gets around to talking about who's gonna get hired. Oh man, then it's, you have feuds that last in departments for, if everybody's tenured, you have arguments that last for 30 years. Your kids will grow up, leave your house, and your colleague 2 doors down is still holding the grudge about the job search that happened 20 years ago because you didn't vote the way that they wanted you to vote. And I come to realize that it's about resources. So you think about, what's the dollar figure how often do these appointments come down the pipeline, right? Sometimes universities have to, in the humanities, those of you who are in STEM, God bless you, you get appointments every year. Those of us who are in the humanities, sometimes it's a bit, the reality is a little bit more grim. Maybe once every 5 years, the provost will say, okay, we'll give you a line. This person over here says in the history department, you gotta hire somebody who teaches Britain, this person Germany, and then you're talking about black this and black that. You see how that goes over in certain departments when you wanna hire somebody who teaches something as a frill or that's an addendum to the real work. And then the dollar figure that's attached to a lot of these jobs is, what is it, $5 million over the course of a tenured faculty member's career? Give or take? So it's not just some sort of abstract conversation about intellectual priorities. It's actually a conversation about money and about resources and who gets what. And that's why some of the conversations get so nasty around these things. So that's also what we're navigating when you want to make the arguments for quote-unquote diversity hires or cluster hires or all of these other sorts of things. And then there are the inevitable arguments that come up around merit, right? If I had a nickel for every time somebody said to me, I could retire if I had a nickel for every time somebody said to me, but we're not going to get the person who's the most qualified. The most qualified always exists in a particular gender, a particular sexual orientation, and a particular body. If anybody else outside of those narrow parameters of what, just Google, go on to Google and Google history professor and see who comes up, right? See what that embodiment of the history professor is. Anybody who doesn't meet that embodiment somehow stole something or somehow got something that they didn't deserve. So that is what we're dealing with. So, the argument that I make, the argument that I will always make is that I'm an intellectual, I'm a scholar. I believe in intellectual standards and academic rigor and all those things. The argument is that is not mutually, that and diversifying institutions are not mutually exclusive, right? And that universities that ignore the need to diversify, they will, over time, they will atrophy and they will cease to be relevant, right? So this isn't about keeping people out or punishing people for the sins of the father and all this other stuff. It's about, right? It's about a different lens for looking at excellence. And it's also about the ethical responsibility of universities not to just take the money of racialized people and have students have no expectation that the people teaching them should look like them ever. That's just not responsible anymore, right? I can't say what I was going to say there, so I'll edit that out because it's sort of implicated in a hiring that took place a little while ago in my old department. But I think it's a real problem when you'll take people's money and students aren't at all mentored by people who look like them or share their experiences, and that somehow becomes wrapped up for an argument in academic excellence. Whereas you can make the argument that if you have a faculty that's homogenous and they can't connect with the students at all outside of a narrow set of texts, That is by definition in breach of the concept of academic excellence. You can't connect with your students. You don't know them beyond the handful of texts that you've assigned. That's a problem. That is a handicap and that is a weakness. So, yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
I already went.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
my name is Chantal Gibson, and I teach at Simon Fraser University. So
Have we
I just
met
wanted
before?
we haven't.
Okay, you look familiar.
You do look familiar too, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming. What I'm wondering is, we have this really big conversation right now around decolonization. Decolonizing institutions, decolonizing the classroom. And much of the focus I see is, a lot of times I think people are getting confused that decolonizing equals indigenous. And so I am I would say faculty member of African descent in my school. And we're getting ready to do an indigenous hire. And I think it was a really important conversation that we began to have is, what does it actually mean to decolonize a space? And because we're hiring an indigenous scholar does not mean that you get to hire one person and they're gonna like undo 500 years of colonialism and it's all gonna be good. And I've just found recently for me that they didn't know that they were getting a black teacher when they hired me. I just showed up and started doing it. And so recently I gave a talk to my school about, there's a whole history of black scholarship around colonization and decolonization. That's what I learned when I went to school, right? And there's people that are like, oh, you're kidding, and they haven't heard of Franz Fanon, or they haven't heard of Stuart Hall or Paul Gilroy. So what I'm wondering is, because I'd like to learn something from you because you're at an administrative level, is like, what can we do to do a better job of using this moment to help folks understand that decolonizing is also about bringing blackness into, and black scholarship into these spaces to help larger conversation. Sorry, that's a bit of a preamble,
No,
but I
it's-
just didn't want to.
Yeah, that is such a great question and a really difficult one
I know,
to
sorry.
answer.
Not sorry. Not sorry.
So I will say this. Well, I'm going to think about that question throughout the rest of the day, and I think we keep this conversation going because my answer is not going to be very satisfactory. I don't think. I think that, and I want to be careful here too because I'm trying to negotiate a space where a lot of the talk around changing these institutions is about indigeneity right now. Both coming from outside institutions in terms of the federal government, coming from inside institutions. And I think that, racialized faculty, we have to be respectful of that conversation, as many of us are. We have to be able, as you said, to be able to bring kind of a nuance of that conversation around, that there are different ways and different avenues into which we talk about colonization. There's also histories of intersectionalities there that often don't come out in conversations, about black indigeneity, black indigenous folks that don't come out in these conversations as well. One of the things in my work I have to be mindful of is not using the EDI sort of cudgel platform, whatever, to further colonize indigenous folks in my institution and trying to navigate that and trying to navigate the suspicions around what's this black man going to do with indigeneity, what are his intentions toward us. So I think for me a lot of this conversation, and I noticed that you mentioned some of the foremost thinkers in the black radical tradition. I think we need to keep highlighting the centrality of ideas and bringing those ideas to the forefront and making those arguments when it comes time to diversify the faculty in terms of transforming the institution, in terms of making the arguments for how various departments should work and what kinds of courses we're going to teach and what sorts of curriculum that we're going to platform. So it's Yeah, I'll just stop there. I mean, I think there's a lot to think about in terms of those questions. And I mean, I get your point. It's hard often for many of us to kind of negotiate that space around indigeneity, particularly when, and decolonization, the way it's framed, particularly when, okay, people at the highest levels of administration like to play, because you know what they do, right? They like to have this sort of zero-sum game, right? So, or they'll say, and maybe this is more prominent in a place like British Columbia, I don't know, given the demographics, well, you know, the question around EDI is really about this. What you people are talking about really isn't central to the conversation, so, you know, go away. It used to be that we would just tell you to go away. Now we're going to tell you to go away, and we're going to talk about indigenizing or decolonizing the academy to make you go away. But it's the same go away conversation, and we have to challenge that at every turn and hold administrators' feet to the fire when they want to make this kind of divisive either or kind of argument, because it's, as you say, it's intellectually bereft, it's bankrupt, and they don't really understand what decolonization means. So that's, you know, in my own small way, that's one of the things that I hope to be able to address in this job. But it's also true, I think, that it's really important for us, if we're going to stay in these institutions and work in them, it's important for us to, you know, get promotions, go through the academic ranks, and then try and get administrative careers. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea. You know, I love writing books in my pajamas too, right? Like, those are the things about being a professor that you love, like on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning. That's why a lot of us signed on for this job. But the problem is that when these kinds of decisions are made, there's none of us sitting at the table. So that argument that you just made, who's here to make that argument at UBC, or who's there to make that argument at Simon Fraser? When the deans and you know, the president, the chancellor, and the provost get together and talk about, you know, institutional priorities, who's sitting in the room? So I think that's like a very kind of practical consideration for, you know, Black scholars and allies who are senior academics to really think about administrative positions. And there'll be some aspect of your academic work that will be sacrificed, but in terms of transforming these institutions, I think it's important for us to be there. Thank you, everybody.